What's happening, hardscapers? This is episode 211 of the How to Hardscape podcast, where we talk about how you can start and grow your hardscaping business. And on today's episode and in next week's episode, we actually have a two-parter. And I'm not a big fan of splitting up interviews into two parts, but this has a good reason for that. Reason one being, when I sat down with this guest initially, I ran out of battery in my laptop when I was on site and interviewing them. So then we picked up the remainder of this conversation on the following day when I could get them back on, and they were generous enough with their time to be able to do that. And during that interview, we talked about a completely different topic. So just to break down the two different topics that we're going to get into here with our guest, Jim Huston. If you don't know Jim, he is a consultant, a coach in the hardscape, landscape, green industry for various manufacturers, vendors, and contractors themselves. He's written several books that are of interest to at least myself, but I'm sure any hardscape business owner, and we get into those books. But if you're interested, go to J.R. Huston, that's JRHUSTON.biz, to learn more about his teachings and his books that he's got. But the one book that really stuck out to me was the critical analysis of MORS, or multiple overhead recovery system. And it's something that has been on my mind for quite some time now, especially with developing initially the spreadsheet a few years back, and now this software, the How to Hardscape Headquarters, which will help you budget and estimate from that. And it is something that I just never sat well with me. And especially the type of business that I run, MORS just doesn't quite, I can't wrap my head around the application to a business and the ultimate complication that it presents, in my opinion. And after these two episodes, I'm going to do a standalone episode myself discussing this as well. But to break down these next two episodes, we have Jim Huston talking about the 5 stages of growth for a hardscape business. And that's today's episode. And then next week's episode is going to be the overhead recovery systems and a critical analysis of every single one, because there's multiple ways to go about this. But we do need to say thank you to our sponsors that really help us continue this podcast. I want to say thank you to GPS Track It. If you need GPS tracking in your hardscaping business, reach out to GPS Track It at gpstrackit.com/how to hardscape to get that conversation started. We want to say thank you to Cycle CPA. If you need bookkeeping, accounting, CFO services, reach out to Cycle CPA at cyclecpa.com. And Inlight Outdoor Lighting. If you have not added outdoor lighting to your landscaping business, now's the time. Get this conversation started with Inlight at Inlight Design. That's INLITE Design on Instagram, to at least get some inspiration from their Instagram page there. And without further ado, let's get into our initial interview with Jim Huston on the 5 stages of growth. Today, we're joined by Jim Huston. He is a consultant for Contractors Association, manufacturers, and vendors on management of the green industry. And you can learn a lot more about him and everything that he's got going on at jrhuston.biz. That is jrhuston.biz. Jim, thank you so much for joining us here.
Well, Mike, I'm glad to join you, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Jim, I've heard a lot of great things about you. I've read a lot of things that you've published online, and it was just a matter of time before we got you down and sat you down for an interview on our podcast. So I'm really excited to have you on the show, especially with the topics that we're going to get into today. But Jim, let's get started to get to know a little bit more about you, yourself, how you got started in this industry and the evolution towards today, wherever you kind of want to start with that here.
Sure. I was in the U.S. Marine Corps back in the late 70s, early 80s, and then I got out of there. I worked for General Dynamics for 2 years. And I knew I wanted to go into business for myself eventually, and got an MBA in finance. And I had a chance to work with a publisher. He published 3 magazines, did that for a year, and then I was going to get back into the defense aerospace with General Dynamics or somebody else. It was dead. And so a landscaper at the church where I was attending knew the publisher. They got talking, and the landscaper said, well, why don't you come do for me what you did for the publisher? And I could only, this was 1987 or late 1986. And I could only imagine some guy out there planting petunias. I mean, I just couldn't wrap my head around it. And so eventually I went to work for him. This is in Southern California. And while I was there, I worked with a guy who was working for Charles Vanderkoy and Associates. And this guy, Steve Smith, he said, we're looking for somebody to consult with us in the California market. Are you interested? And I said, yeah, I am. So anyway, so I started with Vanderkoy and Associates back in 1987. Worked with Chuck for 3 years. Had a great time, and after 3 years, went on my own. And then I realized that if I was going to do anything significant in this industry, I needed to start writing books. And so I started writing a book on strategic planning for landscape and irrigation contractors. Then another book followed. This was 1991. Then I wrote a book on preparing for and responding to a down economy. In 1993, I wrote my first estimating book, estimating for landscape and irrigation contractors. You can notice that these are really creative titles, right? And so anyway, but so then it was just a question of 30 some years later, after spending thousands of hours in offices around the country, North America, Canada, the US, what was interesting, I was probably one of the first people to start using a lot of spreadsheet analysis using Lotus 123. And what I did, I basically put Vanderkoy's budgets and pricing methods into Lotus 123, which is the predecessor of Microsoft Excel. And so anyway, so I started seeing all these trends and benchmarks and patterns. And so I started writing about all this stuff and sort of became the benchmark guru for the landscape industry. And so that's sort of where it all started back there. And basically, the stuff that I bring to the table, I think, a lot of it mostly in the numbers and, dealing with budget, financing, pricing, and all that stuff, came from that background. And that provided a really good foundation as far as what I do. But the thing is that is probably one of the most important things that a contractor needs to understand is how to wrap their head around all the numbers in the business, how to understand key performance indicators, KPIs, and benchmarks, vital signs, if you will. And so that really struck a chord with the marketplace, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So, Jim, going off that, I can wrap my head around where you can accumulate all this data in today's day and age to be able to survey a bunch of contractors from various areas in North America and to create these benchmarks and see these trends. How were you doing it back then to be able to accumulate data, to see benchmarks, and to create these KPIs?
It was interesting. It was just a lot of trial and error. And as I'm putting budgets together, I'm reviewing bids, and in the software in Lotus 123 and stuff, I started noticing gross profit margin trends and patterns, revenue per man hour, all sorts of different things, material to labor ratios, that type of stuff. And so back then, a lot of it was just intuitive. Just sort of took notice of a lot of this stuff. But then when I republished my estimating book in 2003, I got thinking about it, and I said, nobody's writing about benchmarks. So I had a chapter in there on benchmarks. And as a result of that, one of the major magazines decided to pick me up and to have me do an annual benchmark issue. So a lot of it was sort of catch as catch can. And then, like I said, it got a little bit more formal when I published the book, How to Price Landscape and Irrigation Projects. And then after that, it just sort of kept building on itself.
So then this brings me to a question that's something I saw on your website. One of only 2 certified professional landscape estimators in the world. Where does that come from?
That's the American Society of Professional Estimators. Now, that statistic may be a little aged. There may be a 3 or 4 by now. I don't know. But it wasn't when I actually went through the certification process. I ended up writing a lot of the material for future landscape estimators to study and to promulgate. And so I actually, wrote a lot of the test material for it. as well. But that's where it comes from.
Gotcha. And then one last question about your background there. Creating these benchmarks and these KPIs, do you find the trend continuing today that you're able to still continue with those benchmarks or KPIs, or has things like technology, equipment, and everything like that have had you update those year in and year out, decade in and decade out since you created those again and again?
Interesting question. A lot of the KPIs and benchmarks on a percentage basis haven't changed. For instance, if you're doing residential landscape installation, your materials are probably going to be around 30% of your price. And overhead is going to be about 25% of your price. Gross profit margins, pretty much the same. Now, it's interesting, and this is a key area of gross profit margins, is that if you're doing residential landscape installation work, your gross profit margin in a good economy is probably going to be 35 to 40%. A commercial installation in the same type of economy is going to be about 25% plus or minus 5%. So a lot of these KPIs have not really changed on a percentage basis. However, what is interesting from a productivity basis, I like to measure things on a per man hour basis in most businesses. One key statistic is revenue per man hour. How much revenue does a field worker generate per man hour? And what's interesting, take an example of a company I tracked back in 1990. If they had 10 full-time commercial landscape installation people working in the field, not managers, just workers, those workers would generate about $90,000 of revenue per year. And so 10 of them would produce about 900,000. And so what was interesting, and that came down to about $57 per man hour. That includes everything: materials, labor, equipment, overhead, profit, you name it. And so that was 1990. By 1995, I'm working with that company up in actually Maine. And what happened was I'm noticing that our revenue per man hour has gone from $57 an hour to $75 an hour. That's a 31% increase. And so my question was, what's going on here? And so on a per annual basis, that worker, instead of producing $90,000 a year, was now producing $120,000 a year 5 years later. My question is, well, what's going on here? And it turned out what this owner had done, he had put a Bobcat skid steer with every crew. And as a result of good training, good people, the proper equipment, that revenue went from $57 an hour to $75 an hour, and from $90,000 a year to $120,000 a year. That was again a 31% increase. And so, but it was a combination of introducing equipment and mechanization, but also training, making sure you're getting the right people on board. You want people with a good work ethic, and so you combine all that stuff, and you can measure that productivity, increasing dramatically. In the next 5 years, he introduced track loaders, mini X's, and the productivity went from $120,000 a year to about $150,000 a year per person. So 10 people in 1990 produced 900,000. In 1995, it would be 1.2 million. And then 5 years later, it'd be about 1.5 million. And so some things didn't change on a percentage basis regarding these KPIs, materials, and things like that. But some have, mainly productivity indicators. One other key benchmark in all this, in landscape installation work, your field labor is usually going to be about 20% of the price of the job, plus or minus 2%. And this is after I would take any subs out of the job and any profit margin on the subs on there. So these KPIs really opened our eyes up on there. And the other part of this is that most people, when they have me come in today for the first time, probably the key thing that they want to find out is, how do I compare to everybody else? Context. And that's where these KPIs benchmarks really come into become very important.
I want to interrupt this episode to talk to you about GPS Track It. When it comes to running a landscaping business, the question isn't what do you do, but what don't you do? If it's not a customer that needs your attention, it's one of your drivers or one of your vehicles. But you already know that GPS Track It exists to help you know more than what you already know, like the most efficient routes to maximize your service potential, like whether or not your vehicles and crews are where they're supposed to be, like how to save unnecessary fuel costs and other costs. And we're going to be covering the benefits of GPS tracking in the future on this podcast. So we're going to continue with the benefits of GPS tracking, but we'll let our fleet advisors give you the full picture. Call 866-693-1291 or go to gpstrackit.com/how-to-hardscape. Once again, that's 866-693-1291 or go to gpstrackit.com/how-to-hardscape. Link will be in the show notes. I will then ask you the next question, though I have some questions based on what you said there, but getting into growth, because you're talking about production. Yes. Production brings growth. The 5 different stages of growth. We were talking off air about this, just getting into it. But what are those 5 stages of growth to kind of set us up for the context of this ongoing interview here?
Sure. It's interesting. One of the key questions I had early on, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, why do some people grow, a company from, 100,000, couple 100,000, a million, and multiple millions, whereas other people get stuck on there? And that was one of my key questions. And so as I, thought about that, I started noting again some of these trends. And let me, a couple points. What's interesting, I found that basically about 12% of the contractors in the marketplace reach $1 million in sales. Seems like a pretty low number. About 2% reach 5 million in sales. Now, it's interesting. I have a monthly column for Lawn and Landscape, and the editor says, "Jim, where do you get this information?" I said, it's intuitive. It really is anecdotal. I really don't have hard numbers on this, but that's an interesting trend. Now, basically, 98% of the landscape green industry contractors in North America are $5 million or less in annual revenue. Okay. Now, and so if you look at these stages of growth, there are 5 stages between 0 and 5 million that I've discovered. And what's interesting is the transition and how the entrepreneur thinks in regards to these types of growth. And here's how it starts out. You get somebody that wants to start either a maintenance company or an installation company. They get 2-3 guys in the field. At that point, the owner is selling the work, designing the work, running the field, and working in the field on that. And so that's great. If you're doing landscape installation work, you plus 2 guys in the field are going to generate probably about $450,000 worth of work, but about $150,000 per person per year. Okay. Well, the next stage is that, okay, you decide you want to grow, and but what you need to do is you need to have a really good foreman to run that crew, because now you need 2 crews. Okay, so you need 2 good foremen, and then workers to go with that. Then your job as an owner, you got to go out and sell more. Okay, you got to sell more, design more, whether it's maintenance or construction, whatever it is. And so, but to make that transition for going from maybe 400,000 to maybe $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 in sales, now you are managing crew leaders. You manage crew leaders totally different than you manage labor if you're the foreman on here. And so you're removing yourself from the actual end product installation whether it's, let's say, mowing lawn, trimming trees, bushes, whatever. So now you decide to grow more. And so now you're going to add on a third crew. If it was maintenance, you'd probably about double these numbers and get a little bit over $1 million in revenue. So now what is happening, you get 3 crews, 10, 12 people out in the field, but you also need to get somebody in the office as an office person, part-time office person there, maybe full-time at this point. And so then you're probably going to need some help running the field. So you may get a field manager, a production manager, and you manage managers different than you manage crew leaders and different than you manage labor. And so getting up a little over $1 million in sales, you've made 3 transitions in ownership or in your job description. Make sense?
Yep.
And so now here's the thing. So many people, so many guys, I assume women are the same, are sort of hardwired to really enjoy working, producing widgets or doing the end product. No problem with that. But you got to realize is what is happening is your job description changes as the company grows. Now you're managing managers at 1.0 or $1.2 million in sales. Okay. And so if you're going to grow up to multiple millions, up to around 2.5 million, now you need really good managers who require minimal supervision, who are managing really good crew leaders who require minimal supervision. This allows you as the owner to start acting as a head coach. Okay. And this is the key thing in all of this. Contractors, entrepreneurs need to see themselves as more of a head coach, coaching a team, than they do as somebody producing the end product. And that's where so many people can't make that mental transition on here. And so then you get up to, 2-3 million. At this point, you need really good managers. You need to be able to delegate. You as an owner, you need to build the systems, you need to build the team, and you need to network like crazy on here. Make sense?
Yep,
and again, absolutely. A lot of guys, it's like they don't enjoy some of that. Okay, that's no problem. But realize why you are where you are and what your own limitations are. And so as you get up to 5 million, then you got to have a really good team of good managers, good crew leaders, good workers. You're going to need somebody to really do well in the financial end of things, a controller. You're going to probably you're pretty soon going to need an HR person, okay? Because you obviously need the operations people and an office manager to do all this stuff. And so this is where you're thinking, well, it's only $5 million worth of revenue. And for a Fortune 500 company, they spend more on number 2 lead pencils than you do in annual sales at 5 million. I mean, it's crazy. But the thing is, the dynamic, it's all about the people in the business, putting the team together with systems and then networking like crazy.
Makes a lot of sense. Are there certain hurdles between those 3 steps, between those 5 different stages that you see are consistent hurdles that people need to get to? For example, if you're in stage 1 and you want to get to the next stage, there's a specific hurdle that you need to overcome, and same thing from 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 and 4 to 5?
Yeah, I think it's mostly understanding what the next step is. And this is why I've been trying to do a lot of writing about this, is that once people have a clear picture of what the next step is, then it sort of clicks. And this is where I think we do a lot of site visits to the clients around the country. And those site visits, for the purpose of creating vision in somebody, are essential. Okay. You see a lot of things today. You got peer groups, that type of thing, people going to visit other companies. That's what they're doing. They're developing this mental picture of what the next step sort of needs to be. I had a client years ago in California. We called it a brainstorming meeting. And and Sam, the owner of this one company, they're doing probably about $1 million in residential installation work, very high-end work. And we had a brainstorming meeting, and he came and we visited 2 really good contractors in Northern California. Well, Sam, he came to this meeting, And at the end of it, he said, Jim, now I get it. He went back and he put together a company that was very successful, but it was all that vision. It's a question of, being hanging around people, networking, and developing that vision so what the next couple steps are. Otherwise, it's sort of like people playing little league baseball. They never realize that there are other steps where you can get up to the majors. Well, if you never understand that, well, you're never going to pursue it. And so this is where vision is really critical. A lot of guys, and you're really dealing with the mindset of men primarily. And fortunately, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately for me, I've been around guys and sports teams and things. I was in the Boy Scouts. I was in the Marine Corps, which is a pretty male-dominated organization. And so understanding the psychology of guys is critical. A lot of guys go, they won't reach out for help. It's an ego thing. It's like, I can figure this out on my own. Well, great, you do it. And for 20 years, you're going to probably be stuck. And this is why networking is so important. Getting out, seeing other companies, that type of thing, being part of associations, part of, getting around your vendors and all that stuff. I call it's important to build an internal team, but it's also important to build an external team. Your CPA, your insurance agent, consultants, and things like that. And the smart contractors build that external team. And it's a lot more than just grabbing a shovel or jumping on a skid steer, going out and building a wall or putting in pavers or planting trees and stuff. It's all about the on-scene part of the business.
Jim, is it possible to go from the first stage of business to the third, or the second to the fifth, or whatever, that skipping the different steps in the process? Or is that where business owners stretch themselves too thin and go out of business when the tide goes out and they get caught swimming naked? How do you see that?
The revenue sort of goes at the first level about 300,000. 600,000 or 700,000, a little over $1 million, 2.5, 3 million, 4 million, then 5 million, something like that. If you grow too quickly, and if you don't have the team in place to manage all this stuff, you might get the revenue, but you're probably going to overpromise and underdeliver, and you're probably going to have a quality control problem. And so, I think 15, 20% growth a year is pretty sustainable. But in today's market, you can get plenty of work. In fact, most of my clients could probably double their revenue if they had the team to install it, to get it done. Yeah.
Can I get maybe like closing thoughts on the 5 stages of growth? Anything that you want to say on that?
Absolutely. Awesome. So closing thoughts on the 5 stages of growth is, number one, realize there are stages you can study. And it isn't like you're just going to go out and work harder. You want to work smarter to go through these stages. Understand what the stages are, and also understand that the stages are driven by people. The types of people. You're going to go from you working in the field to you managing crew leaders. Then you're going to be managing managers, and then you're going to bring in, financial people and all this other thing. And so I think that number one, understand that you as a entrepreneur, your primary job is to build a team. And then you got to build systems. Then you got to network like crazy and really understand what's going on in your marketplace.
And this is where my laptop ran out of battery. So we pick up right here, and Jim's telling a story about one of his clients that we get into just as we close off this initial episode.
Anyway, so I'm up in Boise, Idaho area. And I have a couple of clients up there, and one client, Hans Ellis, introduced me to the V-Cut Cigar Lounge. And so we would go there, we'd have cigars, bourbon, whatever. So I'm up there, but he can't go that night. So I go, and there's, so I get a cigar, a glass of bourbon, whatever. I sat down beside a couple, and I get talking to the guy, and his name is Gabe, and I said, what do you do? And he said, well, I just bought my father's excavation company a couple of years ago. And so we chat a little bit. And then he asked me, well, what do you do? Well, he knows my client, Hans, So I said, well, this is sort of what I've done for Hans and other contractors. I go in, help them, deal with all the financial aspects of the company, how to price their work, how to format their P&L, how to track things, all this sort of stuff. And he goes, I was just thinking about that. Well, he inherited his pricing from his father, who knows where his father got it, but it's sort of by gosh and by golly. And and I said, well, and he was interested in me coming in to work with him for a day. And I said, well, we'll talk to Hans. He can give you a better idea if you think it is something you need, and get back to me. So he got back to me. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And so now here's an excavator. I think he had about 7 or 8 guys in the field. And some of the equipment he has costs $500,000. And so he had about 20,000 billable hours in the field. And we raised his prices roughly about $30 an hour. Now, and so I went back a year later. I actually did a magazine article on him as well, him and his company. But if you take the 20,000 hours times $30 an hour, that's a lot of money. That's $600,000.
Yeah.
And so, I called him up about 6 months after I saw him. The price, there was no pushback to the pricing. It was actually making the pricing more accurate. But now Gabe had a tax problem. So I'm going, well, okay, that's a good problem to have. But we raised those 20,000 hours on average, $20 to $30 an hour. That's a lot of money. And so this is where so much of what I do is going in and help people, men and women, figure out what is reasonable pricing for their work. So anyway, so that was pretty exciting to see that happen. And I got paid. And the last time I saw him about 4 months ago, we met at the VCUT Cigar Lounge, and needless to say, Gabe bought all the bourbon and the cigars.
Money well invested, I'm sure,
Yeah,
for him, right?
absolutely.
You work hard to build a successful business, and because of this, it is important to work with companies that you can trust, rely on, and whose missions are to give you the highest quality product and customer support. Low voltage outdoor lighting is one of the easiest ways for you to grow your business and increase revenue. Using lighting can make you more profit, add that wow factor, and make your business stand out. Whether you are already using outdoor lighting in your hardscape projects or not, it's time you check out InLight Outdoor Lighting. As a professional hardscaper, we know that you need efficient installs, less callbacks, and premium products to have a successful and growing business. InLight's got you covered. They've created some of the most premium and unique lighting on the market to make your project stand out and wow your clients with their unmatched light quality. It gets better. InLight has an unbeatable customer support team, provides many educational resources like online and in-person training, installation videos, and so much more. They care about your business growth and will be with you every step of the way. For more information on how InLight can help you grow your business, check them out on Instagram at InLight Design. That's at INLITE Design on Instagram. DM them to find out how to put more money in your pocket this season. Now back to the podcast. You've dealt with a lot of contractors, Jim, and just like that example there, do you ever get pushback from contractors when you tell them that you need to raise their rates, and as much as you would need to for that gentleman there? Do you ever get pushback from contractors that say, I can't do that, my market won't accept that?
Well, this is where the way we go about this is we're building on accurate cost data. And so if your market won't allow you to have a reasonable price with reasonable profit in it, you probably need to get in another market. But it's very rare. I mean, most people go, we come up with the numbers and stuff. They're going, yeah, I can get that. That's not a problem. And the problem they're having is being consistent with their pricing. Let's say lawn maintenance. well, let's say two people out there mowing and pruning and so forth. You need to bill $1,000 a day. Well, what happens is for a lot of contractors, one day they're billing $1,000 or $1,100. The next day they're billing $500. So all the money they make one day, they throw it into the hole from the previous day. And so their problem isn't that their prices are too high necessarily, but that they're not being consistent, and every day should be a winner. And so what I want to do is say, hey, listen, here are your daily benchmarks for mowing, your landscape crew, your fertilization techs, your irrigation service techs. Here's what they need to get every day for revenue. If they do that, you're going to make money. And so this is where occasionally some people say, well, I don't think I can get that. Or a lot of contractors don't think they can get it until they try to get it. And then there's no pushback. In Gabe's case, he raised prices 20, $30 an hour. And then I asked him, I said, well, did you get any complaints? He said no one said anything. Well, that tells you maybe you need to raise them a little more, And but that's, I think, the way to look at it.
Yeah.
And so many people don't, but with a little bit of coaching, a little bit of, somebody looking over their shoulder and helping them develop confidence with those numbers. This is why I call my initial consultation with new clients bidding and benchmarking with confidence. I want my clients to really know their numbers, know them well. Because if you're in a really good market, you're dealing with some people who have made a lot of money. They know numbers, they know finances. And I want my clients to be able to go toe to toe with them and explain why their numbers are what they are if they have to.
Have you ever had anyone regret raising their prices that you've dealt with?
Good question. Not really. I mean, it's if you're raising your prices, it means you're putting more money in your pocket. And one of my brilliant observations over the years is that if you're making money, that's a pretty good experience. You're probably happy about that. If you're losing money, going bankrupt, that's a pretty bad experience. Now, occasionally I'll meet somebody who's happy and they're going bankrupt, and I'm going like, we got a psychotic person here. We got to get away from this person. But no, I can't remember anybody that has on that.
And then have you ever experienced a contractor that you went in to help and they were actually overpricing based on their numbers? Yeah. Have you ever had that problem, or not a problem, but they're actually overpriced based on their numbers and they seem to be doing fine, but perhaps they're struggling with something? Or has anyone ever been overpriced? Or when some people are reaching out to you, is it typically, hey, I'm struggling with this sort of financial aspect of knowing my numbers?
Good question. Actually, a number of years ago, probably 20, 25 years ago, I'm working with a woman in Texas. She had a maintenance company, a commercial maintenance company, and she was doing some enhancement work. And there were two jobs about the same, and she way overpriced these two jobs. I mean, made lots of money, but she just way overpriced them, not knowing that she overpriced them. And the client had a lot more enhancement work that he wanted to give this person, but he didn't, because he just figured out, this is way overpriced. And so occasionally that happens. It's more the opposite. People are underpricing things a lot more than they're overpricing. Generally, the market's going to tell you to get lost if you're overpricing too much. And if you're underpricing, the market is going to say, hey, we get plenty of work for you. Come on down. We're going to give you lots of work.
Right.
And so, and because you're losing money on it. And so they don't care if you're getting the job done and losing money. That's your problem, not theirs. So.
Right. And so this is a saying that I've heard or read about in a book in the past, and I just want to get your opinion on it. So it kind of has to do with me asking whether somebody's priced too low or priced too high, but it's about closing rate here. And the quote is, if your closing rate is too high, your price is too low. Do you agree with that, or do you find other aspects kind of playing into that closing rate? What are your thoughts on that? If your closing rate is too high, your price is too low.
That's probably accurate
Yeah.
because what somebody is, and I'll give you some numbers. If you're bidding, like say, residential design build work, the client is probably getting three bids, three proposals. So you should be getting about one third of the stuff you bid in a design build situation. Well, in a bid build situation for residential on that. If it's design build, you're probably the only person working with them. So you should probably get 80, 90% of the jobs you're working with on here. That's on design build. Bid build commercial, you're probably going to get 10, 15%. But again, if you're getting too much work, you need to consider raising your price on that. And so you may be making money, but you're probably leaving money on the table if you're getting too much work like that. But you have to treat it per segment for different type of market as far as what those percentages are on here. Um, and I'd rather be too high than too low on that. And this is where that I'll go into a client occasionally, and it's interesting. Years ago, I was going to a workshop in California. A woman came up to me, and they're doing about $1 million a year in design build residential work. And she goes, the more revenue we make, the more work we do, the less money we make. I'm going like, well, that's an indication that something's wrong in your formulas on that. And so, and this is where that's indicative of a serious flaw in your pricing methods. I had a guy years ago in Boston area, big, this is 1989 or so. I'm working with Chuck Vanderkoy, and he sent me in to work with this guy. He's doing about $5 million a year in sales. It was all mostly commercial installation sales. And he told me, he said, been in business 27 years. The more work we do, the less money we make. And he was barely breaking even. And he said, I never made more than 2 to 3% net profit. This is 1989. That's a pretty big company, 1989, 5 million. and so anyway, so I get in there, and he had a fatal flaw in his estimating system. And it was basically the way he handled his equipment on costing in his bids. But the sad thing was he did 5 million. He barely was breaking even. He had about maybe $40,000 net profit. Should have been at least $600,000 in net profit, because I was working with bunches of other contractors in the area. They were all making good money. This guy wasn't, but he had a fatal flaw in his pricing methods, and eventually it drove him out of business.
Gotcha.
Yeah, when I got there, I was sort of too late. And anyway, it's sad, but people have these fatal flaws in their bidding, and it can cost you your company.
I just want to take a break from today's episode to talk about our sponsor, Cycle CPA. You may have a CRM or project management software in place, but what data are you using to ensure your estimating is accurate? Having a proper accounting setup and accurate bookkeeping done is key to understanding overhead expenses and other costs that must be recouped in your estimates. Cycle CPA is a remote bookkeeping and CFO firm that helps to connect the dots from the financial reports to the hardscape and landscape data needed in order to reach high profits. They provide landscape and hardscape industry benchmarking, job costing financials by service line, advisory meetings, and much more. Cycle CPA's team of accountants are specialized within the hardscape and landscape industry, and you can visit them at cyclecpa.com, and for $200 off, mention the How to Hardscape podcast. Now back to our episode. Mm-hmm. I find that at least some of the contractors that I've watched from the outside, they are underpricing, and it doesn't bite them and put them out of business for a few years. Mm-hmm. So they can think that they're doing fine and they're making money, but then once that piece of equipment that they need to replace goes down and they need to purchase it, the money's just not there. or
Yeah.
then they had to reinvest into their business and they don't have the personal money to do that. Do you find the same thing?
Yeah, the equipment is a big problem, and a lot of people just don't know how to go about handling it, and it can come back to bite you. And a lot of times, people will survive for years scraping by, and what they're doing is they're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and especially in the residential market, you get a deposit for a job you're going to start next week, and you use that deposit to pay bills for a job you completed 6 months ago. And that's a problem. And so this is where people just don't realize that in a good economy, you can sort of get away with it because you got cash flow, and and what people don't realize, they're they're creating this huge debt load that because they're underpriced or whatever, is that they can't pay it off. By the time you get done with the job, you get paid for that job. All the bills for that job should be paid on that. And I'll give you a couple of benchmarks for profitability. I tell people 10% net profit after all the bills are paid, and you as an owner get a reasonable salary before disbursements and all this sort of stuff. And 10% tells me the company is sort of working okay. 15% is excellent. 20% you're hitting it out of the park. And so you want to keep that in mind, is that when you complete an installation job and you get the final payment, every bill for that job should be paid, payroll should be paid, and so forth, and be current with all that stuff. And that's just a good indicator of, okay, things are working okay on that. But most people get in this business not because they went and got a Harvard MBA in finance. They decided to do a case study and go like, I'm going to become a landscaper. And so the business side of this business really suffers because a lot of people get in it because, they enjoy what they're doing. They want to be their own boss. It's a low point of entry. And so as a result, you get a lot of people that don't have very sophisticated financial management skills. And that can come back to bite you. Even if you do have an MBA or a business degree, it probably won't help you much in small business on that. I mean, those degrees are designed to deal with Fortune 500 companies.
Right.
And the typical CPA or accountant doesn't understand some of the things we have to account for in the installation or the contracting business, because it's very different on that. And so if you're not careful, you can get in big trouble.
Jim, where can our audience go to find out more about you, yourself, what you've got going on? Where do you want to send them to? And where can our audience find out more about you?
Sure. My website, jrhuston.biz. So I told you earlier, the city of Houston, Texas, they spelled the city wrong. So jrhuston.biz. You can email me at jhouston@jrhouston.biz. I also have a monthly article, a column in Lawn and Landscape magazine. You can see me in there and whatever, but check out our website, give me a call, or send me an email.
Awesome. Jim, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast episode. Check out more about Jim Huston at jrhouston.biz, and definitely look forward to next week's episode when we get into a critical analysis on various overhead recovery systems. And we want to say thank you to our sponsors, Cycle CPA. If you need bookkeeping, accounting, CFO services, reach out to Cycle CPA at cyclecpa.com. Let them know How to Hardscape sent you for $200 off their services there, as well as In-Light Outdoor Lighting. If you are looking to add lighting to your hardscape business, follow at In-Light Design. That's INLITE Design on Instagram to get some inspiration, and reach out to them to get that conversation started on how to add outdoor lighting to your hardscaping business. And GPS Track It if you're looking for GPS tracking in your hardscaping business for assets and vehicles. Reach out to GPS Track It at gpstrackit.com/how-to-hardscape. And we look forward to meeting with you next week on the How to Hardscape podcast.